All right, everybody, here we go with episode 97 of Return to Authenticity. And this week's guest is Megan Reamer. Wow, this is a great conversation. Megan is a really engaging woman. She's got a great ability to tell the story of her life, and is a super powerful story. She has a very colorful and cool background, having some early jobs that are awesome to hear about. She works for the Wall Street Journal, works on Wall Street, goes to work for one of the leading consulting organizations in the world, and does some amazing work. And then she is a mom. She goes home to be a mom, and she's raising her kids while also working and just living this amazing life. And then she and her husband Scott deal with what is, I think, every parent's worst nightmare, which is a child that is sick and they can't figure out what's wrong with their son. And she talks with great depth and detail about the challenge of trying to learn what is going on, what's the health issue. And she tells this story, and it's just so gripping and inspiring. I know you're going to love it. And so without further ado, I invite you to sit back and get ready to enjoy this week's conversation, episode 97 with Megan Reamer. Welcome to the Return to Authenticity podcast, where we hear inspiring and courageous stories of people who made bold pivots in their lives toward their more authentic selves, that version of themselves they were born to be or they had to find after life threw them a major curveball. I'm your host, Eric Sardina. Welcome and stand by. Welcome to the show, everyone. Today's guest is Megan Reamer. Megan grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and after college, where she met her husband, Scott, Megan worked as a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal for several years before joining the consulting firm Accenture, doing business development and strategy work for the government and financial services industry before becoming a full-time stay-at-home mom with 4 busy and growing kiddos. Megan and Scott soon learned that their oldest son, Jackson, had a rare autoimmune disorder, and it became difficult for him to eat and gain weight. They began learning as much as they could about food and nutrition to help ease their son's symptoms. Through trial and error, they learned that a high-fat, low-carb diet with an emphasis on coconut oil and other premium fats greatly improved his health and quality of life. The availability of snack foods cooked with these oils was virtually non-existent, so they began making their own locally grown, thin-sliced sweet potatoes in coconut oil in their kitchen. The chips were so good, their friends kept asking them to make more and encouraged them to make enough to sell. So they started small and grew the business, outgrowing their kitchen and then a small commercial kitchen as demand continued to outpace the hours in the day needed to make the chips. I'm excited to have Megan on the show today to share how she and her husband Scott fought to find answers for their son Jackson and built a company where his legacy lives on. And with that, Megan Reamer, welcome to the show.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me. That was quite an intro.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So excited to have you on the show and excited to have you tell your story. It's an awesome story. And I can't wait to hear more about your son, Jackson, and everything that you and Scott did on your journey and creating Jacksons and all those good things. So I'm really thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's interesting because all of the information in the background you provided, in my head, like everything in my life sort of revolves around Jackson. Like, not that that's when my life started. I had this great career and I had, this great experience growing up and my childhood and all of that, but just that has been such a primary story and this kind of central, I don't know, this North Star of my entire family's life that it's sort of like, anything that came before Jackson is almost dull or dim compared to like when Jackson arrived and then this entire experience with him and since him, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't wait to hear more about that. And yeah, I remember when you first shared the story with me when we met a few weeks ago. it just touched my heart. I mean, it was just, I mean, it just, as a father, the emotion, the thought of, of what you went through and the fight that you were in and all that's just so inspiring. So I know those that are listening are going to love to hear more about your work and then hear about Jackson as well. So with that, let's talk first
Thanks.
about growing up. I know you grew up in the mountains. You grew up in Santa Fe, which is as we've talked before, a city that's kind of near and dear to my heart as well. Talk about growing up in Santa Fe. What was that life like, and what was your family life like?
Well, I'm one of four girls, and I have just great parents and a fantastic father who navigated five women in his house very
Wow.
well. Um, he's great. Like he had the temperament, the personality. He was a criminal defense lawyer, and so he has this mindset that um, there aren't really many bad people in the world. They just people make bad decisions, and so they deserve second, third, fourth chances. Um, and that these were always the folks, like his clients were always the guys that were mostly men, I would say, not always, but they were always doing trades, so they were the ones painting our house and
Mm.
landscaping and mowing and sort of doing the odd jobs around our house. You'd be like, oh, I've got a client coming over, and we're like, okay, now here we go, doing like putting a new roof on our house, right, because they can't afford to pay it. um,
Wow.
but he had a great, just perspective, and sadly passed away 2 years ago, very unexpectedly,
Mm.
at 80 years old. So lived a fantastic life, but is certainly well missed and by all of us. So I'm the second of four girls, and my mom stayed home and raised us. And yeah, it was like a very sort of idyllic childhood growing up in Santa Fe, doing all the things you do, right? Camping and this real outdoor skiing, outdoor lifestyle. I went to college on the East Coast, which is where I met my husband. During our time at school, we were at this small little liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. And
Wait,
then we both,
before you jump to college, I want to talk a little bit more about Santa Fe, what it was like, because that Santa Fe is a very artsy, kind of eclectic, funky town, right? You've got because my daughter went to college in Santa Fe, so well, we certainly know New Mexico as we talked. You and I've talked before, going to the mountains, more Red River, and a little bit to Santa Fe. We really got ingrained in Santa Fe when our daughter was spent 4 years there, and we learned how it's just it's an art haven, right? I mean, it is, you've got what is the Zozobra, right? You've got like the festival, which is like the Festival of the Dead, and it's
mhm,
some wild. I remember dropping our daughter off for school when she was a freshman, and that festival was like that weekend or the next weekend, and she was like already talking to some. She didn't go with any friends to Santa Fe, but she was quickly making friends. In that I remember that first weekend, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we're going to go to this festival, this Zozobra, isn't that right, Zozobra?"
this is Oprah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
festival. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? I'm leaving my daughter and she's going to go to this crazy festival in the mountains and she
Agreed.
hopefully will survive. And so, yeah, talk a bit about Santa Fe growing up there as a kiddo. And were you a sporty kid? Did you ski and do the outdoors winter
Yeah.
sports, or were you arty, or what was your thing?
Yeah, no, not arty,
Yeah.
definitely sports. And it's funny, my father played softball. That was his like a sport that he played in the league and with his friends. And so all four of us learned how to play softball. We played competitively growing up. That was his one of his ways to connect with us, is to teach us how to hit and throw and
Yeah.
sort of he really enjoyed that with us. But yeah, I mean, Santa Fe is a great place to live as
Yeah.
an adult. It's a great place to live as a child. It's very unique, like you said. It's this art influence is not just sort of that you see all of this beautiful murals
Mm.
and sort of art everywhere you go. It's this energy that imbibes the town, and so you meet some really unique characters. You meet some folks that are so talented in their craft and what they do. But, but I think more importantly, it's this sort of atmosphere and this energy that surrounds Santa Fe, and it's really something you don't get in a lot of other places in the U.S. And so, it actually reminds me in certain ways. I shared that my daughter goes to college in New Orleans,
Mm.
and New Orleans reminds me of Santa
Mm.
Fe
Yeah,
in a
agreed.
lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, People are always up for party. People are always up for celebrating something. There's a lot of, uh, these like vibrant, bright colors that people wear
Yep.
and paint with and express themselves. And, I just saw a lot of parallels between those two cities, which I
Yep.
think are also very unique in the US as well, right? Like you'll go to New Orleans and feel like you're somewhere else,
Yep.
just with, accents, the different dialects, certainly the art there, the
Music.
restaurant scene, the
Mm-hmm.
music scene, right? And I feel like Santa Fe is a lot like that too. And so, it's a great place to grow
Yeah.
up. It was very small town still when I grew
Right.
up there. We were talking about Cerritos Road earlier, which is the main kind of drag, the main strip in coming into Santa Fe. There's all like strip malls along it now and
Yeah.
stores. And, that was a dirt road when I was growing up there. I was
Which
born
is
in
crazy.
1969.
Yeah, it's crazy to
So
think about. Yeah, that it was dirt because it is like an 8-lane road now, and they keep making it
it's a
wider.
monster.
It's
Yeah,
monstrous
it is monstrous, and you've got cars turning in all the
everywhere.
time and turning on left lanes, like off of it, and
Yeah.
it's chaotic. And it was a dirt road when I was growing up, and we lived off of Cerritos, and so I didn't grow up with a lot of money in Santa Fe, and
Yeah.
it's really hard. The thing that's hard about Santa Fe is that there's still this racial diversity
Mm.
um, and sort of, what's the word I want, like segregation.
Mm.
Not as unique as like the South, but there are families who have lived there for generations, and there are newer families there. There are Chicano families, there are white families,
Yeah.
there's just a lot of racial tension that still exists.
Mm.
And so I grew up white in Santa Fe and not wealthy, and that's not necessarily the easiest spot to live in,
Sure.
um, because there's this assumption that if you're white, you're wealthy,
Yep.
and so there's a bit of that still exists there, and certainly did exist when I was growing up there. But
Yep.
I'd say for the most part, people, it's a lot like where I live now in Crested Butte. Like people let you live the way you want to live,
Yeah.
and don't have a lot of judgment about it, and
Yeah.
understand different circumstances, and that people come from hard lives or come from different backgrounds, and they pretty much let you be.
Accepting. Yeah. Right on.
Yeah.
Very cool. Did you, so with your dad being an attorney, I'm curious, you went off to college, did you have plans like I'm going to be a lawyer or I don't want to be a lawyer? Or what was your thought when you went off to school? Did you have one?
I was entertaining being a lawyer. There were parts of it I really liked, and what I saw from my dad, and I'm a lot like my dad, is that it was very relationship driven. He loved his clients. Like
Mm.
he loved trying to help them. He loved trying to get them back on the right path. He really enjoyed all of the relationships. Like when he passed away, it was this, it was such an interesting group of people who came to pay their respects and to come to
Mm.
his service, because there were young lawyers that he was a mentor for. There were clients, lots of clients that came and wanted to share stories about how my dad believed in them when no one else did, and supported them. And um, it was this very heartwarming experience for myself and my sisters. Like we knew about his practice and his career and his profession growing up. He always made time for us. He'd leave things early to come to softball games or to attend something at school or to come to parent conferences. I mean, like we were always priority number one.
Mm.
Um, but but to actually hear that as well from all of these colleagues and clients and coworkers that came to his service, where they knew everything about us. Oh, you're the daughter that lives in Colorado, or you're the daughter that lives in Minnesota, and
Yeah.
like they knew everything because he was just so I don't know, he was just so personable and
Yeah.
gregarious, and we were the apples of his eye, and he had no qualms about sharing any of that. And so, I liked that part of what he did, because
Yeah.
I felt like we shared a lot of similarities in our personalities and what we
Yep.
enjoyed, like very people focused, very relationship focused. The parts that I didn't like were some of the kind of male dominated parts of it that
Mm.
I saw growing up, right? With a lot of men and a lot
Yep.
of strong personalities and a lot of sort of, I don't know, these back and forths of trying to do deals and like,
Mm.
um,
The
I just
lawyering,
wasn't
the
into some
lawyering
of that.
stuff.
The
Yeah.
lawyering stuff, right? I just wasn't into some of that stuff. So I didn't really know what I was going to do when I went to college. Like,
Yeah.
I ended up being an English major, which was very nebulous and murky, and I was dating Scott, who eventually became my husband, who was a chemical engineer and math major. And so like having English as your degree was so far-fetched for him. Like, what could you
What?
possibly do with that? Like,
Right.
you need to work and like
You go to
make
grad school
money.
with that. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh, like something will fall into my lap, which it actually did. Um, but I realized, I think pretty quickly, like during college, that I didn't want to pursue law and be a lawyer.
Yeah.
And none of my sisters, I have three sisters who are all nurses, and so no one went into that profession. I think my father had his highest hopes for me, and that just wasn't
You
something
got
I
the
wanted to
closest,
do.
right? You didn't go
I had
science and biology. You got the closest.
I
Yeah.
did get the closest, but yeah. So I ended up studying English and majoring in English, and then when I graduated college, it was 1992, and it was not an easy market to get
Yep.
a job. And I happened to respond to an ad in the New York Times for a staff writer and copy editor for Dow Jones, who owns the Wall Street Journal. And I ended up getting an interview and landing that job somehow. I have no idea
Wow.
how, because
Wow.
I was interviewing against and ended up working alongside people who had journalism degrees from fantastic schools like Northwestern and Columbia, um, and I felt a little bit of imposter syndrome, like not knowing at all what that
Mm.
would have been called, when I was
Yeah.
23 years old. But like, what am I doing here? Right? Like, these are world-class journalists, and I somehow landed this job like through a want ad in the New York Times.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, I love stories like that. So the whole notion of want ads now is just such a foreign thing. I mean, picking up the paper and going through looking at the little squares, because I did the same thing for my couple of definitely my first job. I responded to an ad in a paper. And that's just gone now, but it's amazing, right? You end up working for the Wall Street Journal after responding to a newspaper ad, right?
I
It's
know,
just
it's crazy.
crazy.
I know, I mean, even then, to me, it was crazy. Like, I even remember telling Scott, obviously, oh gosh, I'm applying for this job, and he's like, okay, good luck. I
Yeah.
believe in you, but wow, that's going to be a long shot.
Yeah.
Which it really was, and so it worked out. I mean, I ended
Yeah.
up working there for several years. It was a great job. I mean, we were part of a union, so I had a great salary right out of the gate. I had great benefits. The union dues were pretty low, but the
Mhm.
experience I got, I mean, I worked at the World Financial Center in New York City,
Wow.
and it was from 1992, like late 1992 until probably 1995, like
Yeah.
spring of 1995. Um, I just, I was tired of living in New York City, which is one of the biggest reasons that I decided to leave. And I left without another job. And that's kind of, sort of part two. But part one of this story is that I had an amazing job with an amazing salary, was able to live in New York City. Scott ended up getting a job in New York as well. He was a year behind me in school. He ended up getting a job, which was also pretty unexpected, that we would be, living there and working, both of us sort of in careers that were related to finance.
Yeah.
And then like staying there for a few years. Like his path was to go to graduate school and get a PhD in chemical engineering, and he lucked into this job kind of halfway through his senior year on Wall Street, and decided, to put the PhD on hold. Never went back and never did it, but ended up having a career in finance the whole time. And so, I would never have predicted that that was going to be what we ended up doing. I think where we went to college, that was definitely the trajectory for a lot of the people. Like that was their goal. They were going to move to Manhattan. They were going to get jobs in finance, or in publishing, or do something. But so many of the people that we went to college with lived in that, like, kind of Connecticut, that tri-state area, that was where they were drawn to. Their parents probably worked in New York City, their fathers in particular. And so I thought maybe I was going to like teach yoga in Taos after I graduated from college. Like I had no idea what I was going to do. And so I ended up, starting this career with Dow Jones, and it was fantastic. I mean, I had a fantastic experience, a great time living in New York. And interestingly, one thing that happened when I was there, so we worked at the World Financial Center. It was across the street from the World Trade Center. When I was working there in 1993, I think it was February of 1993, there was this sort of pre 9/11 explosion that
Truck
happened
bomb.
in the basement.
Yep.
Truck bomb, a Ryder truck bomb in the basement of the World Financial Center, the World Trade Center,
Yep.
when I was working across the street at the World Financial Center. And interestingly, no one, so this bomb goes off in the basement of the World Trade Center in the truck blows up. And we felt that across the street at the World Financial Center. And no one had any idea like what had happened, what was going on. I'd never been in an earthquake before. I thought maybe this was like a little earthquake because we had had this like flyby while I was probably on the 12th floor of this building. And while we were working, like we'd had this helicopter do this flyby of the building for one of the, like it was like Fleet Week or something. And so it wasn't directly next to our building, but like it was close enough that we could sort of feel this little vibration along the windows, right, when that happened. And everyone like looked around at each other thinking, well, was that supposed to happen? Like, were they supposed to be flying by our building that closely? Like, what the heck was that, right? So initially, I think everyone thought it was sort of like this weird little earthquake maybe that happened, or we knew it wasn't a flyby like that because it was like in the foundation of the building. So you could feel this tremor come like through the pillars, through the structure of the building. It bubbled the windows out. They came back in, and then it was gone. And everyone literally stopped what they were doing. And this was a newsroom. Like, it's hard to, like, we had, part of my job as a staff reporter was to pick up the phone and answer the calls from the stringers around the country, right? So like the folks located in Denver, for instance, or Boise, or somewhere that there was an office, and they'd call and like translate. We would take down their story and get it out on the wire, and get it in the set up for the paper for the next day. And so the whole newsroom just went completely quiet. Everyone was looking at each other. No one could figure out what was going on. And then pretty quickly, like, we started to get news stories and get it out on the wire and figure out what was happening. But it was the weirdest feeling of having this experience, and this tremor, this movement come through the entire structure of the building. Like, quite unnerving. It must be what it's like to be in an earthquake.
Yeah. I remember that, so I remember one of the things that was said after that. So the mastermind of that attack when they captured him, they caught him, and as they were taking him away, they said something like, your plan failed, like, because he was planning to take the tower. The idea was to take the tower down with that bomb
Yeah.
in the garage, was going to pull the tower down by blowing the foundation up. And he said, supposedly, again, this is a report and I'm going off of memory here, but something to the effect of, with $1 million more, I would have taken it down. Like, I didn't actually fail. The plan worked. I just didn't have enough explosives. And with $1 million more, I would have, and the tower would have come down. And then that person, again, I don't quote me, but I think he was related to then the second attack. He had some amount of either,
Yes.
yeah, to the second attack that did ultimately take the tower down. But yeah, I remember that. It was, and I think as America at that time, there was still this feeling of, we can't be touched, right? I mean, we're sort of this invincible, protected on all sides by oceans. Yeah, conflicts happen in other parts of the world, but they don't happen on our shore. And when that happened, it, I want to say it sort of pierced the veil, but it almost didn't. Like, we kind of went, well, see, stuff doesn't really happen bad, because nobody really got, I think somebody did die in that. One or two people did die. But it was like, yep, no, things just don't happen bad here. It was still a bit of that arrogance of it. We can't be touched. And then, yeah, that was 8 years before 9/11. And then obviously, yeah. So amazing that you were there for that. I'm curious, because so you were in Manhattan through, I have a couple questions about the journal, but you were in Manhattan until 96, 97. Is that right? Did you
Yeah.
have friends that stayed that were impacted by 9/11 that that stayed
No.
in Wall Street or anything like that? No.
No. I mean, Scott definitely, because he stayed in that space. So even when so Scott and I left Manhattan and moved to Boston actually for his job. I was working at Accenture by then.
Mm.
And so I had this sort of business development and strategy job that was attached to different projects rather than a particular location. So I had the ability even then to work, a pretty remote, flexible lifestyle. So we moved to Boston for his job for a few years and then moved back to New York City
Mm.
for a different job for him. I was kind of following him around until about, I think 1998. Yeah, 1998. I just said, I'm tired of living on the East Coast. I'm tired of living in Manhattan. Boston wasn't quite so bad.
Mm.
It's easier to get around in, it's smaller, but you still like, dealing with parking your car on city
Mm.
streets and all of that stuff. And so I said, I'm kind of tired of this, and I'm going to move to Denver. And so you can come when the time's right. And
Good luck.
he was like,
Yeah.
but wait, we're married. And I said, well, he's pretty flexible. Like, he was traveling so much, and I was the one dealing with, the groceries and
Mm.
the
Up and
parking the
down. Yeah.
car and all of it. Like, the
Yeah.
hassle, the hard part about living in New York City.
Yeah.
No Instacart or anything like that, right? Like,
Yep.
so taking the dog out, all the things. Like,
Yeah.
it was Scott. I was like his concierge, and everything
Yeah.
was sort of lined up and ready when he got there. But I was tired of it,
Yeah.
so I decided to go to Denver. We had a lot of friends that lived there. I had two of my sisters who were living there, um, and just like wanted to live in a house and have, kind of this normal life.
Yeah.
So so we found a house to buy, and moved pretty quick. And then Scott ended up being able to set up an office for the investment bank that he was working for in Denver within probably, I don't know, maybe 6 months or 8 months of making that move. And again, he was traveling so much, it sort of didn't matter where he was.
Mm.
Um, but um, but that was our, transition to leaving New York City
It's
and the East Coast.
it's so interesting to me how your story so far, it's like you're kind of making a way where there is no way, right? So you end up on Wall Street working for the Journal, with an English degree from a small liberal arts school, and yet there you are. Scott's a chemical engineer destined to work on an oil company, and he ends up being you know, in data and analysis and planning or whatever. He uses the big science math brain to do kind of early quant, what would be called a quant now for Wall Street, and it just make away, right? Then it's like, oh, I'm going to Denver because I'm not doing the city thing anymore. And then, oh yeah, so he sets up a Denver office for his firm pre-internet, right? Maybe not pre-internet, but certainly pre-Wi-Fi broadband, and certainly pre this whole notion of we can work anywhere we want and get on Zoom calls and do all the things. And yet there it is. And it's just, you sort of make a way, right? You kind of make it happen, figure it, and just trust that it's going to work, or we'll figure it out. I mean, that's coming out in your story even, and I know that's going to continue in your story, but it's coming out right away, you know, which is very interesting to me. I don't know if you've thought about that, but.
And actually, and it's a really interesting point, because you're right. And that's certainly the philosophy and the mental perspective and approach that we took, you know, toward the things that subsequently were much bigger than what we're talking about, right? Jackson finding a diagnosis for him, starting this business, you know, facing all of these challenges and hurdles in that. And it was just like, we'll just figure it out. We'll do it. Like, let's just do it. And, you know, and I think it's interesting, like one of the things, particularly in your conversations with entrepreneurs, there's so many people who are just stuck in the idea stage, right? They cannot take it to not even execution, but just from step one to step two. How do I convert this from an idea to a thing, either a prototype of something, some action, right?
Yeah.
And people have great ideas day in and day out, all day long, but going from idea to action is a big hurdle for a lot of people to get through.
Yes.
And, you know, and I think it's so in thinking about, I guess, how Scott and I set up our lives and created what we wanted to happen, prior to there really being any model for that or example for that. You know, it goes with the entirety of this story, but it's not really something I'd ever thought of before, because it was just, well, let's just do it. Like, how do you know? You got to figure it out and do it, right?
Right.
And so,
yeah,
I would say, you know, the other piece of that, not professionally but personally, which will tie back to Jackson as well, is, you know, certainly after losing him and going through that experience with our family, every single one of us, my kids, my three other kids included, live their lives like, it's not reckless, but it's definitely this YOLO idea of, why wouldn't I do that today? I don't know about tomorrow or next week.
Yeah.
So like, I'm doing that today. If I want, you know, taking a trip, or, you know, having this experience. And again, it's not in this sort of reckless, like, I'll do anything once, but
Right.
you know, it's not that I'm talking about. It's like, but it is this idea of time and waiting for things, and, you know, and like me remembering that people that I know, my parents' friends who like worked their whole lives and like waited for retirement to do things and like save all their money, and we're going to do this together when we retire. And then like somebody died of a heart attack and they don't even make it that far. Right. And so that's really, those ideas and that sort of idea about how you live your life and how you experience things, is something very important to my family. And it was, prior to Jackson passing away, to just like soak up every minute with him, because we had no idea what his life expectancy was or what his prognosis was going to be. And then very much so afterward.
Yeah. So powerful. And so man, so spot on with that whole idea that we just don't know. You know, we think we know, or we plan, and man, it just, life throws those curveballs at us that we can't predict, you know. I know, and my dad and mom were married for a very long time. So they married in like 57. My mom passed away in 2018. And, you know, my dad very much kind of like the saver, and we're planning for the future and always kind of preparing for the worst sort of thing and being prepared for the rainy day, and worked tirelessly. I think he probably had one, if he called in sick in his career, it was like one day, right? So never didn't show up for work, and then retired, and had sort of plans for, we're going to do all these things. And my mom got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I want to say he retired in 2001. She was diagnosed in '06. She started showing signs in like '04, '05, right? And so about 3 years of that retirement time frame, where until she really couldn't travel anymore. I mean, they had one or two trips. One trip that was good, Italy trip. Second trip that probably shouldn't have gone on just because her health was starting to decline, her memory and that. And then that was kind of it. And then he did 12 years of being kind of her primary caregiver. And so it's just, and he was, he's awesome in doing that. But it just shows you, it's like, man, the 30-year plan, that there's just so many curveballs that are going to come in those 30 years, And so, yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about you have to live it, not in a reckless way, not in a like, oh, caution be damned, and we're just going to throw it all to the wind. But the reality is, don't wait, right? Just make it happen.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I want to ask a couple things. What's awesome to me. So you get the crazy job with Wall Street Journal with an English degree from a liberal arts school. And then you're going to end up getting a job with Accenture, who is like the premier consulting firm. Certainly at the time, they were the number one consulting firm in the world. And it sounds like you did it from your couch, because you said you didn't have a job. You left your job and went to Denver, and you didn't have the next thing. So you had to find the Accenture job, right? So,
Yeah, I actually, I got my job at Accenture through the college that I went to. Accenture hired, actually, when I started working for them, they were still Anderson Consulting, but they hired a lot of people from the college that I went to. It was called Lafayette College. And it was this, it was a lot of liberal arts majors, actually, that they were hiring. They felt like they were trainable for some of the more, technical stuff that they needed to do. But one of the things they really liked was that they were very relationship focused, and that the folks that they hired, the students that they hired from, the I guess pool of colleges that they had, Lafayette being one of them, they were very well-rounded, well-spoken, they could sell business. And so, they had a type of student that they looked for. And I wasn't a college student anymore, but I got a call from the alumni office who had all of my information, knew I'd worked at the Wall Street Journal. Accenture was looking for somebody that had this business development background, had a writer, had this sort of writing experience. They thought that would be really helpful with RFPs and different pitches they were doing. And it was a real gap that they were seeing in some of the skill sets they had. And Lafayette gave them my resume and my information. I kept it updated through the alumni network and the alumni office at Lafayette. And that's how I got my second job. That's how I got my Accenture job, which was sort of like an inbound call from Anderson Consulting. Would you like to come and interview for this job? And
wow.
So I got really lucky. But I'd left my job at Dow Jones because I was tired of living in New York. I was like, I cannot do another summer here. I didn't have any escape to the Hamptons or anything like that. And so it was brutal for
Grinder,
me.
yeah.
And Scott was still working, and he said, oh, my boss at my investment bank, his nanny just backed out for the summer for Bermuda. Like, his children and his wife go to Bermuda for the summer. They need an adult because you can't rent a car in Bermuda, and you have to drive mopeds everywhere, take taxis. So they needed another adult to drive a moped around. And he said, would you want to do that for the summer? And I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? So that's what I did. I was a nanny for about 10 weeks in Bermuda for the summer with this wonderful woman and her two children who were like 9 and 12 years old.
Wow. Riding a moped around Bermuda. How cool is that?
So it was awesome. It was so great. I had a great time. And they were a great family. And, the kids were older and needed an adult to go with them to the beach, to drive a moped, to take them for lunch and, sort of not super little and like running around all the
Right.
time. So it was a different level
Yeah.
of babysitting and being a nanny. And I had two younger sisters, and so it was like super easy. I'd
Really.
grown up babysitting and doing
Yeah.
that stuff. And then I got back at the end of that summer, and thought, oh, well, okay, now what am I going to do? What? And that's when this like in Accenture opportunity landed in my lap. So I really didn't have much of a break in work. It was that summer.
Yep. And this would have been like in 98 or something like that?
This was in 1996.
96. Okay. 96. So the economy is good in 96. I mean, it starts to really explode in like 97, 98. The whole build up to Y2K. Consultants are just working like not every hour of the day, because it's just a right to work time of year, right, for the consulting space. So does Accenture, does it take you on the road, or are you traveling pretty much all the time? Because that they were known for that. Anderson Consulting was a definitely was, because I interviewed with Anderson Consulting prior to getting the job with Ernst and Young later in my career. And it was like an absolute a place that a young professional wanted to work, because they had great clients, you traveled, they paid well, all these things. And it was known like they're going to eat you up with hours and travel, but you're going to learn a ton. You're going to work on the best projects for the best clients, and you're going to make a good amount of money. And so it was very desired. I remember coming out of school in 1990, and then I tried to get a job with them in 90, did not get hired, and then tried again later. I don't remember what exactly year it was, but somewhere in the mid 90s, 95-ish. And it was like, man, if I could only work for Anderson Consulting. And so talk a little bit about what that was like when you worked there.
Yeah, it was exactly like you portrayed it. A lot of hours, a lot of travel. I was on different projects around the country. It was fun though. I mean,
Yeah.
I was the right age to be doing it. I was married, um, but I didn't have a husband at home. You know, he was on the road all the time too. Like
Yeah.
Scott grew up in this family that he's the youngest of six kids. He rarely traveled growing up. I mean, I studied abroad in college, my junior semester, the spring semester, my junior year. I was in Ireland, and Scott came to meet me at the end of that semester. We traveled around Europe all summer together and backpacked. But he'd never been on a plane before he came to.
Wow.
That was sophomore year of college.
Wow.
So Scott had this great job. He was a research analyst for an investment bank, and he was covering the enterprise software industry. So it was like AOL and Netscape and you know these sort of like the internet companies that were not internet companies
Right.
yet. Amazon, for instance, like people couldn't understand how you could buy something online when there wasn't a store, like a brick and
Right.
mortar that you could walk into, right? Like that was beyond comprehension. It was beyond my comprehension.
Yeah.
Scott was like this visionary who would come home and tell me all these things about like the World Wide Web, and I'm like, what? You're crazy. People aren't going to do that.
Right. Right.
You just wait, you see, you can like. So he had this great job and was traveling literally around the world and loving it. You know, he'd never had this experience before. And so I also was traveling a lot, and it was really easy for both of us to have this lifestyle, is sort of my point. And I was on projects in, yeah, different clients around the country, some great places like San Francisco, some places that were really sleepy and quiet like Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
And month-long projects. And the great part about it at that point in time was there was no internet. People didn't have cell phones, right? So there were no other distractions as far as, you're in the office, you're on your job. Nobody wants to go back to their hotel afterward. You're on these projects with people pretty much the same age as
Yep.
you, very similar personalities,
Yep.
similar types of people. A lot of folks like met their significant others on these projects, right?
Yep.
But regardless of that, like no one wanted to be in their hotel room by themselves. So we would always go out to dinner,
Yep.
to bar, play pool, whatever it was, right? No one's going home to watch Netflix or like
Yeah.
get on, FaceTime or whatever. And
Yeah.
so it created these really strong teams that you know, people got really close. It's almost like when you first go to college and you're
Mm-hmm.
like, everybody's new and they want to meet each other. And right, you form these friendships really quickly. That's how these projects were. And so they were really fun.
Yep.
I met some great people who I'm still good friends with. And that environment allowed this other sort of, you know, personal experience and this other type of community to build outside of, you know, the work we were actually doing.
Yeah. That's and I remember, having been at Ernst& Young and Deloitte both, those project teams do get to be really close, right? Because you're on these, 6, 7, 8 week, 10 weeks, sometimes longer projects, and you're in these towns, whether again, like they're a big city or a small city, but you kind of got each other, right? And it's interesting that you overlay the fact that even in then you didn't have any other distraction. There was nothing else to do other than hang out with each other or go back to your hotel room and watch, 3 channels of TV or whatever it was at the time, right? It just wasn't a lot of choices, right? So yeah, it was
Yeah,
even all the more reason. Yeah.
like you were there. You weren't distracted by someone else somewhere else and like trying to connect with them. You
Yeah.
just couldn't do it. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't, you know, we had, like, when I first started at Anderson Consulting, we used Lotus Notes. Did
Yeah. Yeah.
did you use
Oh yeah.
that?
Those squares. I hated them. Yeah.
And it was like, you know, that was our kind of internal email system. That was how we connected with other
Yeah.
people. It was not like the robust system that we have
No.
now, obviously, but that was how we would like message people too, through like just notes me that, right? And you're like,
Mhm.
it was sort of the early version of like an AOL instant messenger
Yep.
where you could message somebody through your network, and it was only your coworkers, right? And so yeah, you were fully focused on what you were doing right there and the people that you were with. And you know, I was on this really great project in San Francisco for probably 8 months, where I just stopped even going home at a certain point. Like I was just having a great time. Everybody
Yeah.
was staying on the weekends, and you really, you know, you develop this camaraderie on the team itself that you're bringing into the workplace. And so I just, in hindsight, I felt like we were able to navigate some sticky situations really easily because we were seeing each other outside of the office. So people weren't necessarily getting stuck in these kind of types or patterns, right?
Mm.
Like that you were only seeing people through one lens and it was in office. You'd sort of have a much bigger context. And so we were able to get through some sticky situations on the job that were just like things that came up with the client or deadlines changing, or you know, people really needing to be all on the same page about something, and just have some great communication
Yeah.
and have some really fun work environments, right?
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
so like working a lot of hours, that made it easier and that made it more fun, that you know, that you could really get on some great teams and
Interesting.
make some
Yeah.
great friends.
It's interesting because you're describing, I can picture it and I can remember it. It makes, even though you're working a lot and there's pressure, it makes work really fun, right? I mean, you do have a very strong team connection, and I almost wonder if that's lost now or if it's easier to get lost, maybe harder to get when you don't have that, right? We have so many distractions. There's so many people that are remote and you're having to connect only via technology, and you don't have that kind of forced time together inside the office, outside the office, and there's just not as much opportunity to bond with other humans in a face-to-face kind of in-person way that we used to have in pre-internet, pre so many different things technology-wise,
Yeah.
and it makes, because the thought now, I think a lot of, if you think about young workers, broad brush here, the kind of the current millennial coming out is like, I want to work 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 and I want to go home. I don't really, the thought of working past 5 o'clock or past 6 o'clock is like, why would I do that? That seems like you're wasting your life, and it's like, man, but the work was, if it's fun, I don't know. It was just a very different time, it was a
Hmm.
very different
For
time.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to even compare because
Yeah.
it's, you know, I mean, obviously the technology is super helpful and I'm
Mm.
not, but there are parts of it that would be nice to turn off
Yeah.
and disconnect from. And, you know, and I could say even just like being on a project like that, for instance, and showing up on a Thursday at the airport and your flight's canceled, and you know you have not had any notice of that because you do not have a phone
Yeah.
that's pinging you, telling you, and you're trying to rebook your flight and get home. You're just there, like
Yep.
dealing. And maybe you get out that night. Maybe there's just this inherent flexibility
Yeah.
that you had to have and patience that you know is can really be lacking in situations now.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. So let's kind of move forward in your story a bit. So at what point do you and Scott start having a family, and what point do you start thinking about stopping work? How do those things play out?
Yeah, so our first son was born in 2001, and then our daughter was born in 2002. I was still working for Accenture then.
Yeah.
I was on, again, some really great projects that I could work a lot from home. I was based with this team in London, and so I could do, you know, just sort of an easy trip to London. I was living in Denver then, and they just started this Denver to London direct flight.
Oh,
So
wow.
so I stopped working after I had our daughter in 2002. They were 18 months apart. So that was pretty chaotic, or that was hectic for me. And I'd say around sort of like just after my daughter was born, Jackson was probably about 19, 20 months old, was when we started to see some, not even symptoms. We just started to see some things, I would call it,
Mm.
with him that made me question whether his development was happening at the rate that it should have been. He could walk and talk, and you know was this happy, healthy toddler, but we started to notice some like muscle weakness in his feet, like very, very, very small. But you know, just like, and I don't even know how to describe it, but just sort of like not pushing his feet as hard, right? Or like having one of his, when he was standing, like one foot would turn in a little bit, and it was like, what's going on? Like, is there something going on, or is there nothing going on? It was that subtle. And then sort of that muscle weakness really started to increase over the next like 6 to 8 to 9 months, where he would try to stand on his legs and then almost collapse, like he couldn't support his own weight. And that's when we started to take him to first the pediatrician, who initially thought, you know, I was a first time mom, I was imagining things.
Mm.
Boys develop more slowly, you know, all of these explainable reasons, but there was actually something going on. But again, it was so subtle that it was even hard for them to see. And so, you know, once it became a lot more obvious where he really was like unable to support his body weight when he stood and had to sit down and kind of scoot around places, and was actively regressing and losing function. That was probably when he was about, let's see, my daughter was probably about a year old, so he was probably about 2.5 to 3 years old.
Yep.
And, you know, we were taking him to the children's hospital in Denver, cycling through all the specialists. Everyone was running their tests, sending out tests to different, you know, specialty hospitals. No one could figure out what was going on. Interestingly, he ended up getting diagnosed many years later, like probably 12 years later, with a disease, an autoimmune disease that they were initially looking at when he was that age. And the testing and the diagnostics for that autoimmune disease were so early in understanding that disease that they didn't have the sort of genetic mutation identified until 12 years later, that was actually the disease he had. So the mutations they had identified at that point in time, there were maybe 3. It ends up that there are like 7 mutations. It's something called Aicardi-Gutierrez syndrome, and it's AGS for short. It's named after the 2 French physicians who identified some of the mutations. And so when they were testing my son for this very early on, they had to do a spinal tap, so lumbar puncture, get some spinal fluid, send it to France to these 2 physicians who identified it, and then wait months and decide if that's, that came back, that testing came back positive. And it didn't, because my son did not have this inherited disease. It was this spontaneous genetic mutation that happened in him. And so these other ones that they'd identified were inherited, and I'd say easier to find. They could test the parents a little bit as well, and you had to do a lumbar puncture as well at that point in time. Now they'll do like whole genome sequencing and just do it off of blood work. But they did test him for this disease that he ended up having, and finally getting a diagnosis many years later, after he had lost his ability to walk and talk, and he lived in a wheelchair for the rest of his life.
So in the early years of his starting to have some of these symptoms, he was able to express to you like what he was feeling. He was able to kind of talk about it and talk about what he was feeling in his legs or his feet or his body. Was he able?
A little bit.
A little bit. Yeah. And
yeah,
then,
I mean, his vocabulary was still pretty minimal, but he
Yeah.
could point and he could show.
Yeah.
He regressed. It regressed up his body over about a year period. And so it started in his feet, where I said, it was sort of this disconnected, where he had trunk control, head control, he could still sit, he could feed himself, he had fine motor control, but he was like dragging his legs behind him and sort of like commando crawling everywhere, or sitting up and like scooting his butt. And, Scott and I were frantic, like something's clearly wrong. We got these crazy explanations in the beginning, like he has cerebral palsy, and you just never noticed it. And we're like, no, like he could walk and now he can't. So, that was really pointing to something genetic or metabolic. That's typically the case in particularly young children under the age of 3. There can be these like, I don't want to call them late onset, but there can be, these sort of genetic and metabolic diseases that you don't necessarily notice right away. Some children will like never gain certain functions, or track with their eyes, or have head control. Others will gain skills and then lose them, right? So for my son to have gained the milestones and the skills that he did and then lose them, it didn't really fit that profile. There are also genetic and metabolic diseases that are more specific to certain ethnicities, like in particularly like Ashkenazi Jews have a lot of have a statistically higher rate of certain genetic and metabolic diseases, right? And so we didn't fit into these categories. He specifically, we did not, ethnicity wise, and so we still had to go through all the testing of all those things, though, right? And those diseases are tragic and difficult and hard and terrible. And, and so we'd leave these appointments, and the doctors were like, yeah, well, I mean, we don't have the results back, but the greatest likelihood is that he has this specific metabolic disease or this specific genetic disease, and he'll be dead by the time he's 3 or 4. And so, we were living in this very stressful, unknown, gray area. We had another daughter who was very close in age to him, and thought, oh my gosh, like, what if this is something genetic? And she starts to experience these same symptoms and the same illness. Like, it was really challenging and very hard. Scott stopped working. He took a leave and was just home helping. We had this like newborn daughter for the first year that Jackson was experiencing symptoms and losing function. We had this really healthy daughter who was gaining all of her skills. And it was like emotionally really challenging time for both of us. We wanted to celebrate this healthy child we had and our healthy daughter, and that we're grieving like our son.
Yeah.
and the loss of his skills. And so, if I fast forward that significantly, we took him to the National Institute of Health when he was 13 years old. They have an undiagnosed disease program. And it was, I can't say enough wonderful things about it, like just the physicians who were there, the National Institute of Health itself, the process, like the whole thing was A++, first class experience. The doctors we met with there were PhDs and MDs. And so they were very interested in all of the stuff we had done around his food and his diet to stabilize this loss of skills and try to keep him alive, basically. And that was the first time Scott and I had any validation that food and the specific diet we fed him played any role in his life and saving his life. And the other doctors that we'd seen were smart people and wonderful. And we're like, I don't know what you're doing. And I don't know why you're feeding him that. And I don't know why it's working, or maybe it is, but just keep doing what you're doing. Like, they really had no answers. And so it wasn't until we met this team at the NIH that they dug into that. They really understood, why fats would play an important role in managing inflammation, why carbs play a role in, increasing or decreasing inflammation. And, how all of those pieces would work together to at least try to manage the inflammatory load that he had in his body, which is what it did. And so that was where he eventually got a diagnosis. About a year after we'd been there and participated in that program, we got a phone call from them and said, like, we know what's wrong. We want you to come back. We want to talk to you. And it turns out that it was that AGS. It was that disease that they had tested him for when he was about 3 years old. And they finally, had the testing catch up to the disease, and were able to map his gene sequencing to this specific mutation that he had. And he was one of 7 kids in the world that had this specific mutation. So for us, it was, obviously a relief to finally get a diagnosis, to understand like what we'd been doing had actually helped and, really saved his life. And, that our other kids, no one else is a carrier, or other children aren't affected by this specific genetic mutation. And then within a year of that diagnosis, he was on this experimental drug trial to try to manage the inflammation and decrease it in his central nervous system.
And so that was that trial that he was on. It wasn't available earlier in his life because the trial didn't exist, because they didn't know enough about it to even have a trial. Is that
right?
Is that, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we never gave him any medicine for, like, even when we were trying to understand, and we knew that there were some specific abnormalities in his central nervous system and in his immune system in his central nervous system, different like protein markers that were abnormal, different inflammatory markers that were very, very high. Even then, like, no physician wanted to prescribe anything for him, steroids, or, we did some IVIG immunoglobulin therapy for him to try to address some of the immune deficiencies, but he had not taken any medication really for any part of this disease prior to going on this experimental drug trial.
Wow. And yeah. Okay. And what is your take on, so what I'm, so you described that at like age 13, 14, and yet the story kind of started when he was around 20 months or so. And so there's a decade in there of time, right? And so you're finding your own answers during that decade, right? You're basically trying things. And so is he losing weight? Is he having trouble with digestion? Talk a bit about some of the things that you start to like, well, we're going to try this, or what were your, in light of the fact that there were no diagnoses and no doctors that were giving you really a plan or a pathway to follow, what did you and Scott start doing along that journey? Pardon the interruption, everyone. Do you ever feel like you're out of alignment with your true gifts, your passion, and your purpose for being on this earth? Do you feel like you're grinding it out each week with the appearance of success and still asking, is this it? If so, I get it. I've been right where you're at. And once I figured it out for myself, it's why I started coaching. Now I help my clients get back into alignment with their authentic self. I help them find meaning, purpose, joy, and energy in each day. Check out my website at ericsardina.com to learn more and to schedule a free 15-minute strategy session. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you said. We just started to experiment because the only thing we could control was like literally what was in our house and what we were feeding him. And he was at such a primal level of no one thought he was going to live. And he was incredibly underweight. So we were feeding him this fantastic diet. And it wasn't, we weren't cleaning up a diet that was full of preservatives or colors or, they're highly processed. Like he already started out really well with eating, sort of organic foods and I'd say a really good ratio of fats, proteins, and carbs, right?
Yeah.
A pretty solid diet. And then, should we go gluten-free? Is the gluten an issue? Like, is he having a hard time digesting that? Okay, everybody goes gluten-free, right? So like just making different iterations in this pretty healthy diet already. And still like he wasn't gaining any weight. He wasn't benefiting from those choices. And I really give a lot of credit to Scott because we were just flailing. Like we really had no idea where to turn. Right. And Scott, I think his chemistry background played a big role in this because he found this cookbook called Nourishing Traditions, which is this whole philosophy around diet and food as medicine. And it came into our lives at this time when we needed something like that. And Jackson really needed some additional dietary support that he wasn't getting. We never had a feeding tube for him. One of the conversations we were having at that point in time was putting a PICC line in him and having him take like central CPN, like central line food. And, that wasn't a long-term solution either. It could keep him alive and keep some sustenance in him. But Scott found this cookbook and in just like trying to research. And again, like when this started, Jackson, we were going online looking at like medical publications and journals, and there weren't groups of people to connect with that had similar symptoms. There was none of that stuff. And so, we were going really deep into research and clinical documents. And so in finding this particular cookbook at this point in time, there was a lot of conversation. There was a lot, this cookbook is more than just like recipes, right? It was why you soak grains and what you're trying to do if you soak grains before you cook them, right? Soaking nuts and sprouting nuts and this whole kind of throwback to cooking with the types of foods and like, maybe your grandparents did, right? So using lard, why would you use lard? Why would you use coconut oil instead of a polyunsaturated vegetable oil? And what does that do to your inflammatory load? What does that do to your body if you're consuming certain types of oils versus other types of oils, right? So all of that information was actually contained in this cookbook. And Scott really started to do a lot more research around fats and lipids. And if we change this type of fat in Jackson's diet, does that matter? Will that allow him to gain weight? Will he digest that easier, right? And so we really started to kind of, I'd say, do this trial and error and test whether changing up the foods that we were feeding him, which were already very healthy, but like, should we use coconut oil instead of avocado oil? Those kind of questions, right? Should we use sweet potatoes instead of white potatoes? What's that going to do? Every single thing we fed him had to be like the maximum caloric, nutrient dense item that we could find. And starting to do that and like pursuing that for probably I don't know, within probably 2 to 3 months of really embracing that philosophy of food, we could start to see a difference in Jackson. He was starting to gain weight. He was starting to sleep longer. He couldn't sleep for more than like an hour or two at a time. So he started to sleep for longer stretches, started to gain a little bit of weight. And we're like, okay, well, we're onto something. And Jackson at that point had lost all of his voluntary motor function. And so when you lose your ability to like reach for something and pick it up, you start to get all of these reflexive movements back, right? Like very primitive, like a newborn baby. He'd have these like newborn reflexes that had come back, and he'd get stuck, like locked into these positions. He couldn't move through them, and very uncomfortable, very, in a lot of pain, a lot of nerve pain, like actively losing nerve function. And so, what we started to see in pursuing this diet and going down this road was that, he wasn't getting these sort of digestive GI issues, in not having these GI issues where he was having sharp pains or having trouble having a bowel movement or, gas. Then he wasn't getting into these reflective neurological positions, right? And so they really tag teamed each other, the neuro and the GI stuff, as they would, right? As like how many neurotransmitters you have in your GI, right? And like how that mimics, it's like your second brain is your GI system. And so those things were so tightly connected for Jackson that when we saw a difference in his GI and in his digestion, we saw a difference neurologically. So like he didn't get up and miraculously start walking, but he had a much better quality of life because he was gaining weight. He was in less discomfort. And then he wasn't getting into sort of these reactive positions and postures because he was uncomfortable. And so we just kept doing that. Like we just kept doing more of that. And it started to work. And in gaining weight and sleeping, he started to have a lot more of a sort of relaxed neurologically, and his central nervous system started to de-escalate a little bit. And that was just like how we lived until we got this diagnosis. Like we knew if we fed him too many carbs or something that didn't agree with him, his symptoms would spike and his neuro symptoms would spike. And so, we lived in this period for probably a year or 1.5 years where it was like all really bad days with maybe one good day every other week, right? And that the tide started to turn, where eventually sort of 1.5 years to 2 years out from beginning this diet and really looking at his food in a different way, he'd have mostly good days with like one bad day every other week or every 2 weeks, right? And so we knew we were doing something right, and we just kept doing it. And then his quality of life started to improve because he felt a lot better, and he was gaining weight, and he was healthier. And and I would say, and sleeping, it's a huge thing, right? And so I think we took a bit of a break in trying to find a diagnosis. Like we were so burned out and spent on taking him around the country, living in other places. Like our daughter was, we only still had one daughter at that point, and she was like along for the ride of that entire thing. And I think like we came back to Crested Butte probably full time in 2005-ish, early 2006 maybe. I had another child in 2006, and we took a break. We were just like, we're done. Like we need to heal. We need to circle the wagons around our family, create some routine, create some just a stability, like just settle down a little bit. And, we were still talking about losing Jackson. And we thought, well, if we lose him, we want to lose him in Crested Butte. Like that's our home. That's where we have our memories. Like that's where we would want him to pass away. So there was this, like, we were living in this dual reality of preparing for him to pass away and not be with us, and trying to save his life every single minute of every single day. And then, we got back here and things did stabilize, and he stabilized, and we were able to kind of, get in this groove of not feeling so frenetic and crazy and stressed, like urgent, like everything was urgent, right? We were able to sort of all of us settled down a little bit,
Yeah.
which was great. And then we just existed in that space. And we would take him every once in a while to, like, I actually just ran into this friend recently at the library here. He was working on a deck, building a deck for us, probably around 2007. And, saw Jackson in his wheelchair and asked about him and, what's going on. And I was explaining, and he said, my brother had this like transverse myelitis when he was younger, and he looks a lot like Jackson, and this is what was wrong. And, so sometimes things would pop up like that. Like that got me thinking, maybe we should be doing some more testing, and let's go to, National Jewish Hospital in Denver, which was like, and is one of the best immune research hospitals in the country. And so then we did a little more testing, and we found out a little bit more information and some more abnormalities, right? And so we were continuing to do that until we went to the NIH and got the diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious if at this point, what your take is at this point in the story, what your take is on the ability to kind of, the medical community really hasn't provided you anything at this point, right? I mean, nothing tangible. You're figuring it out on your own. You're figuring it out with things sort of homeopathic, right? It's diet, sleep. How do we, make him feel? Just let's focus on the basics. Let's get him to feel better. Let's get him to sleep better. Let's get him to gain weight. And we'll do that with the things that we can figure out on our own. I'm curious if your take on the medical community changed during that time, or if it ever, or what maybe it was. And I'll just add a little to that is, my take is, for most of my life, I would have said the medical community is going to give us the answers relative to health. And I would say now as an adult, my take is the medical community is really not the place we go to find health. It's almost more the place, to help us when we just have no other answers. But really, many of the answers that we are seeking, we can find with you talk about the gut. Like, I'm just now starting to learn about how important the gut is, and the hormones in your gut and the things going on in your own, which has a lot to do with what you're putting in your mouth, right? What you're eating, and sleep, how important sleep is, how important regulating your body with breath, and some of these other things that have really nothing to do with medical school or the medical community. But it's only just recently. And so I'm just curious, like, how you maybe came through that time and how you were being influenced in that.
Yeah, when we first started to do the testing for Jackson, I thought we'd go to the doctor and they'd tell us, well, here's what's wrong, right? We'd run all these tests, and we saw so many doctors, neurologists, immunologists, infectious disease, genetic, metabolic, right? Any specialist you can think of. And so when they were sending us home empty-handed, I was like a wreck, right? I was just not the person that I am now. I was very influenced by what they were saying and taking it on, right? Without really kind of even creating this maybe more objective interaction with them, right? Like they're giving us their opinion. They're giving us what they think might be going on, but they don't have any real tools that say, or any real results that say that's exactly what's happening, right? Scott was a lot better at that than I was, in keeping much more objective. And like when we left somewhere and they were telling us this worst case scenario, I was just crying and like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my son. And he was like, nope, we're going to go to the next doctor. Like, we're going to go to the next doctor. We're going to get answers. I mean, he really kept that very focused and kept that together for us. And so I eventually got a tougher skin around it and try to be more objective around what they were saying, ask the right questions, try to, poke some holes in what they were saying to us, right? Like, I don't have to just accept this and take this on, right? And so I'm going to actually push back on you and ask you some of the hard questions.
Right.
And I'd say, like, when we first started, it was very much this idea, and the doctors we dealt with were, I know, I'm the physician, I'm the specialist, I'm the expert, you listen to me. And as that evolved, like as we evolved over time, in those interactions, the doctors also evolved. And so we, I think we did a good job of seeking people who listened to us and really heard what we were saying and wanted to work with us, and ended up having a pretty good experience with those specific physicians because we felt like it was more of a partnership. But we had to be very active in finding those fits and finding the right people. And, parallel to doing all of this stuff with Western medicine, like we were doing all of the other stuff with Jackson, right? Energy work and homeopathy and herbs and, acupuncture and anything that we thought could make any difference, even on the margin in his daily life, which it did. And so, my daughter wants to be a doctor, my older daughter. And she's got this great perspective because she grew up doing all those things that her brother did and getting massage and having body work done and, and existing in hospitals and listening to neurologists and orthopedic surgeons and, every other specialist. Because when you don't, like for my son, when you don't walk, you get all of these secondary and tertiary issues, like with your feet and your hips get dislocated and all of these other, issues and problems start to arise when you can't move your body in the right way. So, my son had some significant surgeries for a dislocated hip and was in a body cast and things that are really challenging as well. And so, I think, I still trusted the medical community and believed that we'd find out what we needed to find out, and hoped that we would at some point. And I think, it certainly made me more aware of what advocacy looks like in for yourself and for, a loved one and how you need to be and what you need to do and how to be effective in that role.
Yep. All right. So let's talk a bit about the discovery of the chips, right? So now you mentioned the sweet potatoes. You mentioned figuring, is it, do we give him regular potatoes or sweet potatoes and these different oils that you're experimenting with food and trying to figure out what can actually help him to be comfortable and gain weight and sleep and all this stuff. And you come across this, these chips, or I guess you're making chips in your own home. You're taking potatoes and you're boiling them in oil. Talk a bit about the discovery of this and then how they tasted and what you started to learn.
Well, we were all eating this very clean diet, right? Like paleo, basically. And there was not a lot of crunchy, salty things that were part of that diet. So how they happened to just how we started making them in the first place was, I was really craving something salty and crunchy. And, I said to Scott, like, he was doing most of the cooking because he was very specific about what he was making and how he was making it. And I said, I really need something like salty and crunchy. Like I could probably eat tree bark right now. Like I am like,
I'll eat it.
Something. And he's like, okay, let me figure out. I'll make you something. So he just starts frying up. I think he started cooking them initially in lard, like frying up white potatoes and sweet potatoes in lard, and because you couldn't buy them in a bag anywhere. And then, the lard's really fussy and hard to work with and has to be the right temperature. And so then, they weren't really lasting very long. Like you had to consume them immediately. Couldn't store them. So then he's like, well, maybe I'll make, let's try them in coconut oil. So then we started cooking in coconut oil, which were delicious. And, we could store them, we could have them. So that was really like how we started making them, just kind of experimenting for my craving that I was having. Our kids loved them as well, Jackson and Ella, but we could store them and we were also like eating at home all the time. We really couldn't go out to eat anywhere. And so we were always having people over to our house. And so then we started serving them to people that were coming over and they're like, oh my gosh, these are the best chips I've ever had. Like sometimes we'd make white potatoes, sometimes we'd make sweet, didn't really matter. We always cooked them in the same oil. Coconut oil is really fussy to cook with as well. So are sweet potatoes too. And so we really developed this, like we knew what temperature we needed to cook them at. We knew the timing, right? We knew if we took them out too early, they'd get a little soggy, right? So we had dialed in this whole process just on our stovetop. And people would come over and say, you know, oh my God, these are the best chips I've ever had. Like, have you ever thought of starting a chip company? And this was probably in 2008, 9, 10, like those years. I had another child in 2009. And so, you know, it was probably right before I had him, and then certainly in the years after. And, you know, we'd laugh it off and say, no, like, how would we start it? No way. We're not starting a chip company. Like, we don't know anything about potato chips, CPG, like consumer packaged goods. Scott was traveling still almost every other week to New York for his job. I now had four kids, and, you know, one needed help for everything. And so we just kind of brushed it off. And then in, I'd say like 2012, I just started to think about it a lot more. And like, there still wasn't a product on the shelf that we could buy. So we were still making them. Coconut water was like really starting to come on the scene. People were understanding coconut water. People were starting to understand coconut oil a little bit, like why you would use that instead of a different type of oil, or that you could even use it to cook in. And so I just started to like press Scott a little bit more, like maybe we should start a chip company. Like everybody says these are great, you know. He's like, they're our friends and family. Like, of course they're going to say they're great.
They get here, like, they're hungry, we feed them. What are they going to say, right?
Right? And he's like, yeah, people don't listen to people. And so I think though I turned his mind, because it changed his mind, I should say, because I kept saying to him two things, like, we have the right opportunity to do this. It's the right way to tell Jackson's story, because food played such an important role in his life. And how are you going to feel if someone else does this? Like, how are you going to feel if Kettle puts a chip like this, or Boulder Canyon has a chip like this on the shelf? You're going to feel like you missed your opportunity. And he's like, you know, initially that wasn't really working. And he just was like, Megan, it's a lot of work, and like terrible margins. You don't make any money, and you really don't make any money unless you sell like your company. And I said, no, we can do it. So we started. So he gave in and started like, okay, let's, how do you even put chips in a bag? What does the bag need to say? What should be on the cover? Like, what's the design, right? So we did all of that stuff ourselves, had this little snack size bag. We're like, okay, let's just fry them up, put them in the bag, see if anybody wants them. And we did that through the health food store here in Crested Butte. Our friend runs it. And we asked her, and she said, yeah, sure. Like, sure, I'll put your cute little chips on the shelf and see what happens. So it took us we probably made like 50 bags of chips. And that took us probably 3 weeks, because we were doing it at night after our kids went to bed. Just like taking everything over to the commercial kitchen, setting up our pans, frying everything up. And we took them over there middle of July, really crowded time in our town, lots of tourists. And our friend calls the next day, who owns the health food store, and said, Megan, we sold out of them. We need bigger bags. We need more flavors. Like, how soon can you get us more chips? Like, people loved them. And so that was like really the start of like trying out this business to see if it's even a business. And there's another health food store 30 miles away who's also friends of ours. They let us put them on the shelf. And so that's what we did until we made them by hand, put them on the shelves here locally in sort of, let's see, like the fall of 2012. My son Jackson had his hip surgery in the summer of 2012. So he was in a body cast. So we're like carrying him everywhere in a body cast, frying up chips, starting this business. We decided to like create a website, put stuff on Facebook, which was the social platform at that point. And just like announce that we had these chips and see what happened. Like, will people come? This is what we know how to do. And they did. And so like, we used to have to open up the ordering system and then close it as soon as we sold out of the inventory we had. And like, we were making chips every night. So our inventory was probably, sometimes we'd have like 100 bags, 200 bags. It was just a function of how much we could make. And we'd sell out of them really quickly. We had to limit the amount people could purchase, and then we'd have to close up the ordering system again. And people would get really snarky and mad. Like, I waited for you to open the ordering system and you closed it already.
Yeah.
And so, within the first 3 months of having that website, we had shipped to every state and like 10 different countries. And that's when Scott was like, maybe we're on to something here. Like, maybe there is a need and people are looking for a very specific oil in that category. And that was really like the start of it.
Was the word of mouth, people in other countries are buying it, all 50 states are buying it. How are you advertising? How are they finding out about it?
We weren't advertising. Like, we weren't doing anything on Google. Like, we weren't doing any search ads, anything. It was just our website. And so people, when I remember searching, like, how are people finding us? It was, we had a Facebook page. So people were starting to find us through that. And like those reviews and comments on there, not reviews, like really just people saying like, I love these chips. Wasn't like a 5-star review or anything formal, but I think they were Googling like healthy chips, healthy potato chips, and they were finding us that way. It was pretty crazy. I mean, we were getting calls from different retailers saying, so-and-so, one of our customers brought your chips in because they were in Crested Butte and we would love to carry them. There was nothing on that shelf in that particular oil.
So
and it was really this white space.
Now and I don't even know if you would consider these competitors, but I know now if you go to Whole Foods or you go to, Sprouts or even Costco, you see here's pea pods that have been made into chips. Here's, carrots that have been made into chips. But was any of that existing in 2012, 13, 14? No one was. It was either a white potato chip in oil or lard or whatever it would have been. No other, you had no competitors really in this space.
Right. We didn't.
Product. Yeah.
We didn't.
So super unique.
And, it was very unique. There were a lot of people looking for it, more so than we ever imagined. It was new and flashy in that aisle. And it was they were really hard to make. Like, it's not easy to cook with coconut oil. And none of the manufacturers are really set up to do it. Like, when you're not using a canola or a sunflower or safflower, right? You can run those through the same line. Coconut's a different beast, and it solidifies at a certain temperature, right? And you have to like change out the oil that you're using between safflower and coconut, for instance, right? Well, no manufacturer wants to do that. There's no reason for them to do that.
Right.
So for us, like, we were making them by hand. For us to find a co-manufacturer to make them for us was the next step in this process, where, kind of 9 months into making these by hand, my husband, who had a job in finance during the day, was like slicing with a mandolin every single potato we were frying and was getting tendonitis in his elbow. And he's like, okay, this can't continue. And so,
did it feel insane at some point? Did it feel like we've lost our minds? Like, we've got enough on the plate and here we are standing over a fryer, frying chips, putting them into bags, slicing potatoes. Like, what have we done? We are professionals. Like, we are very important executives and moms and professionals. And yet we're making potato chips at night instead of sleeping or watching television or reading a book. Right. Did it feel insane at some point, or were you just like, no, this is just our life. What's what we're doing?
Yes, it did feel insane. And when you say it like that, it's like, in the face of reason, why would you continue doing this? But I don't know why we did. I think we both felt that it was a lot of purpose in it, that we were sharing Jackson's story and we were this extension of Jackson. And so it was a way for us to make lemonade out of lemons, and people were reacting really well and positively to it, right? People loved them. And so it was like, well, why don't we just keep going? And
the chips were called Jacksons. I don't know if we said that. The chips are called Jacksons. So that is, your son's name is the chip, right? And so that is, you're really doing this. So it's like an homage to him, right?
Yes.
As you're doing
and it was then too. And so it's like, we just felt this sense of purpose, I think, Scott and I both. And and then we were getting really positive feedback about it, and then thought, well, this is fun. Like, this is fun. And if we ever saw a bag of Jacksons on the shelf at Whole Foods, great, we're done. Like, we've achieved what we want to achieve. We've accomplished it. We'll just walk away.
Yeah.
Well, it was not that simple. You know, we were in deep by that point when we got that bag on the shelf at Whole Foods. We were like, oh, well, we got to keep going. Like, there's more to come after this, right? So let's keep amping it up. And it was really just the beginning of what was happening with what was going to happen with the business. But I think we just felt this real sense of purpose. And, you know, our other kids were helping, and it was this family thing that we were doing. And so we just kept going. And we eventually found a co-packer who was based in Denver, actually, and really wanted to work with us because we'd been making them by hand. And so it was really, you know, we cold called them and said, here's what we're doing. We need to make a lot more bags than we're able to make. And we can't go into, like, Whole Foods wants our chips, but we don't have bags that are big and ready and sealed and made correctly, like not by hand. And natural grocers wanted our chips as well. And so we were kind of in this chicken and the egg. Like, they wanted our chips, but we didn't really have chips to give them in the size that they needed, and like possibly another flavor or something. And so, but the co-man was like, well, what commitments do you have from the retailers? You know, so it was like, we had to make product before we could get in there. And so they took a chance on us, this co-man in Denver. And they said, you know, you've been making them by hand for as long as you have. Like, we like that. Like, we get a lot of calls from people who've never done anything and have no idea how it's going to operate. But we like your story. We like why you're doing it. And we like that you've been actually doing it. So come in and let's do some test runs. And Scott ended up, like, living at that plant for several weeks and doing a lot of test runs with them, and, you know, created the process that allowed them to make, like, our first production run of thousands of bags, which I almost started crying when I saw them. Like, the amount of time that would have been impossible for us to do. And they were a great partner for us. They really helped us build our business and launch our business. And, you know, I can't say that about every co-man we've worked with, but they were fantastic people to work with, and they really, like, allowed us to get our start.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when does Shark Tank start to come into the story?
So we went on the shelf with Whole Foods and natural grocers in 2014.
Okay.
And I said, like, we had $0, you know, I'd say, I don't remember what our revenues were in 2014, at the end of 2014, maybe like a couple $100,000 in revenue, almost $1 million. It was pretty quick. And then, you know, within 3 years, we were at like 10 million in revenue. So it was very fast, very quick. Still not profitable, still not a profitable company. Our co-manufacturing situation was not a long-term solution. Those were just margins and economics that didn't work for us. Shark Tank came into play in 2017. There was an article about our business and my son's story in the Denver Post, and the Shark Tank producers, the ABC crew, saw that article and reached out to us and asked us if we'd be interested in auditioning. And so we had a different experience. You know, it kind of landed in our lap, like some of those other things that I shared with you with my job. Because typically you go and audition and pitch, and it's like thousands of people there, and they listen and hear and decide if they want to move you through. They came to us and asked us, and over the course of sort of, like, I'd say March through May, we did all of these different things. They, like, answered questions, sent them videos. You know, they would reach out, like, randomly. We had no idea what the next step of this process was. We would just answer the questions they had, and they'd say, like, send us a video of you and Scott talking about, you know, the first time you made chips together or something, right? And we kept making it through their different rounds. And so at the end of May of 2017, they asked us if we would like to come and pitch. They said, we'd love to invite you to come and pitch. Can you come in June and pitch to the Sharks?
Yep.
So we went at the end of June. And the whole process is really interesting. It's not scripted, which everyone thinks it is or assumes it is. The only part that's scripted is the first 90 seconds where you work with that production team, that ABC team, to create your hook, right? To create what you're saying to the sharks to get them interested. And then the rest of it is just this free-flowing conversation. They usually last about an hour, where you're standing up there, like managing all the sharks, like answering their questions, whatever.
Yep.
And so we went at the end of June and did that, Scott and I. And it was, that part of it was really fun. Like the Shark Tank, the business, the talking about our business part was fun. And then the like show business part of it was really fun, right? Like going to hair and makeup, waiting in our trailer for them to come get us with the golf cart and drive around the lot and take us to the green room and all that stuff. It was nerve-wracking. Like I was very nervous. I think Scott was too. He just manages that a lot differently than I do. Because I, like 30 seconds before we were supposed to walk into the tank, turned to him and said, "I don't think I can do this. Like, I think I'm going to throw up." And he's like, "Oh, you have to do this." Hell no. Like, I feel a little sick. So, but it was really fun. We got out there and it was this conversation among all the sharks, and we had a great team of people. And we ended up getting a deal. It's a handshake deal.
Before you jump there. All right. So because I'm so curious. I'm not a huge, I've watched Shark Tank a number of times. I know the format and stuff, but I'm not like a diehard. Like I've watched every episode and all this stuff. So do they tell you like, okay, you're going to, this is what you're going to, and I know you said it's not scripted, but do they tell you like you have to, your role is this, and then, Scott, your role is going to be that. And we're going to ask you one question about finance and one question about nothing.
None of it. Nothing.
And then
you go in there blind.
You don't know. So
and they go in there blind.
Oh,
like,
they're blind
the
too.
sharks are in there blind. They only see your company like right when you're coming out or like when they're preparing the set. So for us, and like we didn't know who our sharks were going to be until we walked out there. So they don't say like, they can ask you any question they feel like it. And that's the hard part about preparing for it, because it's like, we went over our finances in and out and like our P&L and our balance sheet and just trying to anticipate all the questions that they were going to ask. We're not huge Shark Tank watchers either. And so some people really study that before they go, or, really study different sharks and who they're sort of pitching to while they're out there.
Right.
We just went out like really winging it. And not in the sense of like being prepared. Like we were very prepared, but we were like just letting that experience unfold without trying to engineer it anyway. And it worked out for us. But no, they don't. There's no sort of roles that you play, or Scott's going to answer these questions. He ended up doing most of the finance questions because that's what he did for our business as well. But there's no real instruction from the team.
And it's not shot over multiple days or iterations. You get one, like when you stand in front of the lights and the sharks are facing you, that happens one time. They ask their questions, you respond. It's either a deal or no deal, whatever happens right there. So it's not,
there's no
like a cut and edited show that's all. Okay.
There's no do-overs. It's not like, oh, wait, let me back up and answer that question again. Okay. It's real time. And so, that's one of the really hard parts about it.
Yeah.
And you don't know what they're going to ask you. And they're cutting each other off to ask each other questions. Like Robert would ask a question, but then Barbara would cut him off. And it's like, wait, what?
Yeah. Who am I answering?
Right. So you have to really think on your feet. It's really interesting when you see people go on there and just flail and like really melt down. I can only think that's nerves, because you have to be, they really vet you out, right? They get like probably 40,000 applicants, and they narrow that down to 110 people. And then out of that 110, they invite probably 85 to 90 people to come and pitch in person. And then out of that number, they still cut it down. Even if you get a deal, there's no guarantee you're going to be on television. So they really like have huge filters that they put people through
Wow.
in order to even make it there to pitch. And then when you see people on television who are just like not executing well,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine what's going on other than like some real nerves. They have a psychologist on staff who comes in before you pitch and comes in after you pitch and like counsels you beforehand on how
Wow.
to try to just maintain your energy
Stay
level and kind
calm.
of
Yeah.
corral your anxiety and
Mm.
like, have a little bit of anxiety and like be a little amped up, but like not just,
Yeah. Yeah.
melt down before you even get there. And then afterward, for us, it was because we had a deal, like every single person you've ever, like your middle school boyfriend is going to reach out to you after he sees you on Shark Tank, which is actually true. And, and it's just trying to counsel you about all the attention and sort of next steps and how to manage everything that's going to happen once you get this publicity.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. And so you mentioned it just a minute or two ago. So you end up getting a deal done. So one of the sharks, and he was the guest shark, right? He's not one of
Yes.
the typical 3 or 4 that are on there. And
Right.
he agreed to invest, and you have to kind of, that's done on the fly too. So he's offering you like money for a percentage of your business. You're having to do the math and figure out, is this a fair deal? Is it not fair? Did you feel like you really did the business need, like, if this doesn't work and we can't come to terms, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing? Or was it like, we got to get a deal figured out here? If there's a deal on the table, we're going to get one done.
We could have kept going and we could have found funding somewhere else. We needed way more funding than we got on that show.
Yeah.
Like we were at this big inflection point for the business. And
Yeah.
so like we needed more like kind of $5 to $8 million in the business at that point,
Yeah.
which we thought he would help us access that, which he eventually did. It wasn't in that time frame that we needed it, but he actually helped us set up the deal that we have in place now with the new investment team that we've got, and it's been fantastic. So our shark I really like a lot. His name's Rohan Oza, and he's still in the business, and he was great to work with. So it was really positive experience. But like 50% of those deals don't go through that you see on the television.
Oh, really? So even though it appears to go through, it doesn't get done at the end of the day. I see.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because you start this whole due diligence process with that shark. You've already gone through due diligence with the ABC team. They verify all your financials and stuff. Then you go through it really deeply with the shark, or we did anyway.
Yeah.
But that was in June. We did all of that, and my son passed away from this drug trial in August of 2017. So the Shark Tank crew had contacted us probably late July, early August to see if they could come and film extended footage in Crested Butte and have that be part of our episode that aired. Again, we still didn't know if we were going to air. We didn't know a date, nothing. They just said, we want to come and get some extra footage, and we want to video Jackson at your home. We want to see Crested Butte. And they came on August 10th and did that and like filmed, everywhere here. And my son died on August 13th. And
wow.
So it threw everything into, well, of course it would, but it threw all of that process into this question mark.
Yeah.
It was just this hard space for everybody. Like our team didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do. I mean, it was completely unexpected. It was the result of this drug trial. We had just increased his dose like a month before and had taken him to the trial was operated out of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And so myself and my daughter and I and Jackson had been in Philadelphia 2 weeks prior to the Shark Tank coming to Crested Butte to do a follow-up appointment. Everything looked great. And then my son, and one of the reasons this drug can't get FDA approval still is because of an increased risk of pulmonary embolisms. So my son ended up dying from pulmonary embolisms. And probably like in maybe the days right before, probably the 8th, 9th, around then of August, he started to not he wasn't feeling that great, but still fine and eating and everything. But something was brewing, and we just didn't know what it was. We were trying to figure it out. And so even when the Shark Tank crew was there and filming, you know, he was still part of everything. He just wasn't feeling 100%.
Mm.
And and then he ended up passing away on the 13th. And so, you know, when I called the Shark Tank people after that and told them what had happened in the couple days after, you know, they were shocked and they were like, "What do you mean? We were just there. Like, we just took all this video. Like, he was fine."
Yeah.
And so, you know, they were very sensitive, wonderful. You know, we'll scrap it. Like, we don't have to do any of this. You tell us how you want to proceed. Like, let us know at some point. You don't even have
Yeah.
to do that soon. And then we decided, like, as a family, that we thought it was the right thing to do and way to honor him and share more of his story with people, and spread awareness about the disease that he had, because we talked about it on that footage. And so we ended up doing it, and they aired it on the season premiere, which was October 2nd of 2017. So it was like 6 weeks after he passed away.
Wow.
And
Wow.
yeah,
Man, unbelievable. And he lived for such a time. I mean, because from the beginning, when he was when you're going through all the difficulty and the stress and chaos, the doctors were basically saying he's going to die. I mean, you were talking about appointments you would have. They're like, no, he's going to die very soon, or he's not going to live
yeah.
very long. And yet he lived to be, how old was he when he passed? 13, 14,
He was
6,
16.
16. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, you know, we had worked so hard to keep him alive for so long. I think that was some of the shock for Scott and I, of
Mm.
just like, it was so immediate and sudden. The
Oh,
pulmonary embolisms just like burst. Like, he vomited and never regained consciousness. I mean, it was that
that's sudden.
catastrophic and quick. Um,
Wow.
and so for Scott, it was like, there was so much, we were in shock about so much of it, but that was one of the pieces of, like, we worked for years to keep him alive, and he
Yeah.
died in like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Um, and we didn't know what he died from. I mean, it took months for an autopsy and to understand. So when I'm calling people to tell them, my family, you know, friends, everyone, they're asking me, you know, well, what happened? What do you mean? Like, I
Right.
just saw him yesterday. What do
Right.
you
He's
mean?
lived through all this. What happened?
And like, I think people thought because he lived in a wheelchair that, well, this was on our radar, like that
Yeah.
was somehow tied to this life expectancy because he, you know, was disabled and lived in a
Mm.
wheelchair. And it was like, he was really healthy.
Yeah.
And so it was a shock for everybody when I was letting everyone know, and they had a lot of questions, and I didn't have answers to those questions. Um, and, you know, for us, it was also like, I think we were able to continue to do what we were doing and keep this business going because it felt like a vehicle through which to keep him alive and some real purpose,
Mm.
and that, you know, and that we could continue to say his name and talk about him every day,
Hmm.
and keep him alive. And the way to do that outside of our immediate family doing it was to keep him on people's radar and to keep the brand on people's radar and the business and keep it going. And so that was the real reason that we decided to do Shark Tank and let that air and go through that, because you know, at the end of that episode, they'd never had that happen before, like
Yeah.
the ABC team. So at the end of the episode, at the end of our airing, they put a little in memory of Jackson Reamer and the dates.
Yeah.
Well, for some people who I hadn't been able to contact, like, that was
Oh,
the first information they had that he'd passed away. And so it was like a lot of inbound
yeah.
activity after Shark Tank. Plus, we did all the Shark Tank, like, PR stuff and went on Good Morning America and all these shows. And so it was like,
Oh,
you know, we were doing all of that to share about the experience of Shark Tank and the company, and like having to navigate how we talked about Jackson and keep it very private. It was really hard.
so
But
the PR tour stuff was happening after he passed as well.
yeah,
Oh, wow.
whole
Yeah.
fall.
Oh,
Mhm.
wow. Oh, man. Wow. Were you
Yeah.
with him when he passed?
Yeah, Scott and I were both with him
Oh,
and my youngest son. We were actually driving to Denver from Crested Butte, and we were going to Children's Hospital to do some tests because the doctor who was managing the drug trial had been running some tests here in Gunnison when we were saying, like, he doesn't feel great. And like, he looks like maybe he's starting to retain some water, like he's getting a little puffy. And she was having us do some blood work and run some tests in Gunnison at our local hospital. And then on Saturday, he died on Sunday afternoon. On Saturday, I spoke with her and said, we'll go to Children's tomorrow. We'll drive there. We can do more tests. Like, he's in better hands.
yeah.
And so we were on our way to Children's, and we were about halfway there, and he vomited and lost consciousness. And my daughters were here in Crested Butte, so they were about 2.5 hours away from us. Someone had to bring them to us, and it was like, I was trying to figure out. I said I didn't want to tell her what had happened, but she knew something bad had happened. The woman driving them, and I didn't want, like, my only one of my daughters had a phone, but I didn't want her to have access to her phone because I didn't like. I'd already talked to my family and my sisters, and they knew. So I didn't. It was really hard. Like, I didn't want them to hear about this in a way that was in any way other than from Scott and I.
Yeah.
But there was this time lag, and so they came and met us, and then then we all, then the whole kind of process started of what happens next. Like, we were in this tiny little town, and it has its own coroner, and so he became a good ally to us, and we wanted to allow this autopsy to happen at Children's because we wanted to understand more about this disease and felt like that was an important opportunity that Jackson could, this doctor could direct this autopsy and take tissue samples and find out all this information that could help other kids with this disease. So it was there was some complication to it. But it was, we were there, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Wow. Thank God you were there. Right. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, because I was like not going to go. I jumped in the car at the last minute, grabbed my youngest son. He wasn't like sick. And so Scott, was like, you stay here with the other kids. I'll take him.
Yeah.
You can follow me and come later and bring the other 3 kids. Right. We were used to tag teaming everything. And like, one person dedicated to Jackson and the other person dedicated to the other 3. And so I just like, I won't say I had this feeling. I just sort of like, no, I'm going to come. I think I should come. It's going to be helpful to have 2 people in the car. He's not feeling great. Like, I'll just come.
Yeah.
And then our son was only 8 years old, so I didn't really want to leave him.
Right. So you grabbed the little one. Yeah.
Friend. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And okay. And so then, kind of the going forward part, right? So then now he's passed, and so you're like you said, you have the show stuff that's got to happen, the business still has to run, and so you just kind of keep going, pick up the pieces, kind of keep going, or was there a time when, I mean,
I mean, we were back at work,
there, like, right? So you've got your other children, you've got responsibilities, so you got things, and yet you have you're mourning your child, right? And
it's hard.
Yeah, it's devastating.
It's we kept going. My son died August 13th, and on September 13th, I was in Los Angeles at our Sharks house, like we were doing this strategy meeting. So I think maybe Scott and I had about 2 weeks where we just stayed home and, handled our other kids, got them off to school. They started school. It was hard to know what to do. Like my instinct was I wanted to drop out and leave and like go to Hawaii or somewhere where I didn't have to interact with anyone except if I wanted to, and do that for at least like 6 months. The reality is I couldn't do that. And so, my daughter was starting high school, freshman year of high school. And it was like, does she start? Should we give her some time? Like all these questions that we then had to answer, right? Two of my kids are born a day apart, like August 28th and 29th. So then we had like, let's have we got to have a birthday party, right? Like no one felt like having a party,
Right.
but there was some sense of normalcy that we had to continue to create.
Yep.
And for ourselves as well as our kids, and just like we're going to keep moving forward. We have to keep moving forward. And I don't know if it was the right decision. I think in hindsight, my kids would say they needed space and they needed more time. I also didn't want them to get derailed at all and like, you know, live in this space, exist in this space that then became hard to get momentum and move forward.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. It's hard to know what the right thing to do is in that situation. And it's a lot of gut instinct, and it may or may not have been the right thing, but we had to keep going.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
you know,
you
we
did
had
the thing, right?
employees depending on us, and like we had to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And your family's intact, and you did what you did, like right, wrong. It's like you did it, right? You did it, you got through it, and it was, you managed your way through it. And that's incredible, right? That you're able to do it and not just end up on the ground in the fetal position, you know, and not able to function. So it's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the hardest moments in that whole experience, besides, you know, the gaping hole I felt without Jackson there, and that everyone felt really, was like, this happened on a Sunday. We get home Sunday night. You know, I don't sleep at all. Scott doesn't sleep. The other kids are like, everybody's just amped up, and like no one's quite sure how you relax. And so that the next morning, I think, is one of the hardest moments of that, because like I looked at my kids and said, okay, we're gonna get through this.
Yeah.
It's gonna be okay. Everybody's gonna be okay. Like we're gonna do this together. And like really had to tell them something I didn't believe at all. Like I had no idea what we were doing or whether I was going to get through it. So, you know, I think about that moment a lot, because I had to show up when I felt like I couldn't, when I didn't want to. And all of these other pieces of like the trials we've gone through in the business, and the hard times, and like the hard times we went through after this in the business of like needing funding and not having it, and kind of like scaling the business back and all these things. It was like, none of that really compares to these fundamental moments that have happened because of Jackson. It's kind of what I said in the beginning of this conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like that's still the point of reference, and all those things we went through. And, you know, they really pales in comparison. Like, yeah, they're hard times, and they're hard times in your business, and they really stink, and they're not great, but like, it's not the worst thing I've been through.
Yeah. Right. Right. Incredible leadership through that. Right. It's inspiring. It's incredible. So the business goes on, your business continues to grow and evolve, and kind of bring us to where the business is now, and what your family's kind of doing now, and how things are.
Yeah, sure. I'll wrap it up for you. The little bow around it all. The business after Jackson passed away went through some really, really difficult times. You know, we had too many products in the marketplace. We were overextended on capital. We were still not profitable. So we actually used COVID was a really great opportunity, because late kind of 2019 was when this was all starting to get to a head. Early 2020, and we pulled back most of our products, kept it really simple, went into just certain retailers. Like Whole Foods has been our partner the whole time, and got some new investors in the business. We were able to do that in July of 2020, and that's made a huge difference. And so I'd say from like probably September 2019 until that deal in July 2020, pulled the business back, bare minimum production. Scott and I running the business, let go of all the team members, like this existential question of, do we keep going and keep running the business, or do we just close it up? Like, here's the capital we need. We don't really have a line of sight to that. You know, here's ideally what we need on a manufacturing basis, which was our own self-manufacturing. Like, how do we get that in place, right? And so I had this wish list, and we were able to, again, like with our shark, he was a pretty big player in this conversation and what we were looking for and the partner that we needed. And he helped us set this deal up that we ended up executing in July of that year, 2020. And then really analyzing the business, analyzing our best selling product, which has always been sweet potato, and trying to understand, how do we lean into that? How do we innovate around that? How do we really make that our core, like what we do and do it well? And keeping it really simple. And so that's what like we did in the business throughout the rest of 2020 into 2021, a lot of data, rebranding, getting back on the shelf in retailers. So I had a lot of hard conversations at the front end of that, like very honest, very transparent, very difficult conversations with different suppliers and vendors and retail partners about what we were experiencing, what was happening. Then COVID happens and kind of blows up the entire space. And so it's like, you know, what seemed like a big deal to them prior to COVID with our brand was really not on the back end of it. And so the timing was actually pretty good for us. And then, you know, we went back to those retailers and suppliers and vendors, and I had like better conversations. Here's where we are. We've got our own manufacturing facility. We've got, you know, the financial pieces in place. We can be a good partner and relaunch the brand with sweet potato chips only, and innovating along flavors and, you know, different types of oils, avocado oil now as well, and have gone back to market with that. And it's been hugely successful, really great reception, great distribution in places we weren't selling before, like Costco around the country. And so, you know, it's on an upward trajectory that's really exciting. And I think I feel really grateful and really lucky that this has come full circle, because I know a lot of businesses close and like end up closing, and that's it. You can't restart something from the ashes here. And we were able to essentially do that and still tell Jackson's story through this process and through this business and keep this legacy going.
Yeah. And that's awesome. The manufacturing, is it done here in the US? What kind of, where, I know you're in Crested Butte, but where is the rest of the company or the business?
So the business is headquartered outside of Milwaukee, about 20 miles west of Milwaukee, in a town called Muskego. That's where our manufacturing facility, that's where our, you know, all of our ops team is located, and the executive team. Our investors are located in Wisconsin as well, not far from Milwaukee. And so that's their home space. And that's, you know, that was what created the opportunity for us to be able to stand this plan up and get that access and make it happen. It's great. It's in a really, the business is in such a wonderful place. And we've got the right people in place to be leading it, and sales team. And, you know, I feel really grateful to be able to keep working there and keep working with them and be part of the business and growing it.
What are your thoughts on the future of the business? Where do you see it going? Do you have I'm sure you have a plan or anything you can share, like this is what we think we're going to do with it, or take it, or different lines or different products, or anything you can share?
Yeah, I think we'll end up eventually bringing white potato chips back in probably avocado oil. We just went through a plant expansion where we've got new kettles and new lines. And so we've got a lot of capacity. We can do private label and contract manufacturing. We can also meet the needs of some of our bigger retail partners like Walmart and Costco. And I think, you know, it's a big operation, but we act like a small business. And so, you know, it's innovative. We have a great R&D team. We can turn new flavors around really easily and quickly for ourselves, as well as other kind of private label or contract manufacturing partners we might have. And, you know, and I'm sure there's a sale on the horizon, probably in the next 36 months, I'd say 3 to 4 years max.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got the we've got a great brand and we've got a great brand story. We've got great products. And one of the biggest assets we have now is this manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
As well.
Fantastic. Love it. Incredible story. I mean, it's just so inspiring. I so appreciate you being willing to go in all the places you went with the story and just sharing so much. And it's just an incredible, tapestry of just all of it, right? From your childhood, the different things that kind of led you along the path that you're on, and right through your ability to kind of navigate all this challenge with your son, the challenge with the business, and keep your family intact, and all these things just incredible. Really, really awesome. Well, again, I mean, I cannot thank you enough, Megan. It's such a great conversation, and I just so appreciate you being willing to share it so openly. Can people, if people want to find your chips, they want to kind of follow your story, connect with you, do you have any social media stuff you do, or website, or anything at all where you would point people?
Yeah, sure. You can always go to the website, Jackson's Chips. We sell them on our website. We sell them at retailers around the country. We sell them on Amazon. Our social handles are the same, Jackson's Chips, on Instagram and Facebook. Let's see, those are probably the best places to understand what's going on. We have a newsletter, but it's great to have them available around the country for people to buy and get introduced to.
We'll put those links in the show notes, and there's also
Thanks.
a Shark Tank episode out there as well that people can go find. I know there's a link on the website to just a cut of it, like a small snippet of it, about a minute and a half or so of the show. So yeah, they can go see it there, I'm sure, as well, right?
Yeah, that's fun.
Fantastic. Again, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Eric. It's been great talking with you.
To our audience, thank you for taking time to listen to the show. Always appreciate you do that. If you could write a review, give us a rating, share the show with a program even, share the show with a friend. It helps us reach a broader audience. Until next time, friends, I'm Eric Sardina. You've been listening to the Return to Authenticity podcast, and bye for now.